Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, tech reporter Alexandra Levine. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Brittany.
We're here today to talk about the latest in the battle between TikTok and lawmakers in D.C. TikTok filed a lawsuit after President Biden signed a bill into law that would either force TikTok's parent company ByteDance to divest from TikTok, or if it chooses not to, the app would be banned in the United States. Do we need to know about TikTok's latest lawsuit?
The potential for TikTok to be banned nationwide in the United States has been thrown around for at least a couple of years, ever since former President Donald Trump threatened to ban it in 2020. And since then, you've had states like Montana that have mounted their own challenges to try to ban TikTok statewide. Now, the most recent law that was signed by President Biden to ban the app unless TikTok's owner, ByteDance, will divest its crown jewel and sort of split the two companies apart, is the realest threat we have seen. It's really an escalation of everything that has been happening around the app over the past couple of years in Washington. I think that what a lot of people didn't realize when they saw all of the headlines a couple of weeks ago when Biden finally signed this law is that there is going to be a really long and protracted legal battle to fight this on the part not only of TikTok, but also on the part of creators and small businesses who rely on the app. And so even though it seems like all of this is happening really quickly, we know for a fact that it will take at least until January of 2025, if nothing else really happens, for the app to be shut down, as in removed from app stores, US app stores. But I think that because there is such a large legal battle ahead, which we'll talk about today, it's unlikely that anything is really going to happen before then, and it could potentially be longer.
So, talk to us about the Biden administration's goal. Do they want to see TikTok shut down?
The Biden camp has really emphasized that they don't intend to shut the app down. They have really emphasized repeatedly that their goal is to find a new owner for the app so that all of the national security concerns that exist around it can sort of be calmed. Now, just to take a step back, the national security concerns that are really at the fore of this entire fight are really twofold. One is that there's concern that the app, because there are 170 million Americans who use it, could be used to surveil or monitor or otherwise track individual Americans. My Forbes colleague, Emily Baker-White, broke a story a couple of years ago about how the company was actually using the app, the TikTok app, to surveil her so that they could try to find out who from inside the company was leaking information to her. So that's just one case, but what is so important about the case and what happened to Emily was that it really is emblematic of what could potentially happen if that was done on a larger scale. So the first national security concern is, can the app be used to surveil individual Americans? And the second big national security concern around the app is, can the app be used to push content that would either sow discord or really manipulate and disrupt public discourse? And I think in an election year, that kind of a concern is really, all the more urgent.
Forbes has really been on the forefront of this issue. As you mentioned, Emily Baker-White's reporting that TikTok was actually surveilling her. You pointed out some other instances of Forbes reporting that showed ByteDance's surveillance tactics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Some of my reporting from last year that was focused on a trove of internal documents that I got from inside the company focused on speech issues across ByteDance platforms. I got internal documents and spoke to sources who were inside the company who described that ByteDance has a system for monitoring the sorts of words or language or phrases that are used on many of its platforms. So these are sensitive, words that ByteDance considers to be sensitive, that have to do with political topics, cultural topics, societal topics. And many of them are around really hot button issues. There were things that were related to COVID. There were things that were related to geopolitics with Ukraine, Russia, with former President Donald Trump. And there was indication basically from these documents and sources that ByteDance was monitoring speech around those things, and in some cases actually suppressing and censoring it. So that was one other example of surveillance, not in the sense of, watching somebody's location and trying to find data on them, but really it was more in the sense of watching what people are saying and then reacting to it. And I should say that ByteDance denied that had been done on TikTok, but we certainly have indications that it has been used on its other platforms. And I should say that many people don't realize that one of the most popular other apps in this country, called CapCut, is also a ByteDance-owned app. There's another ByteDance platform here called Lemonade, which is also quite popular among Americans.
So let's dive into what we need to know when it comes to this lawsuit. You broke that down. So let's talk about those other apps, because you point out in your reporting that ByteDance doesn't just own TikTok, they own a slew of other apps. So under this, would all of those be banned, A? And B, what does TikTok have to say about this?
The key goal of this law that President Biden has signed is really to address national security concerns around TikTok. But because ByteDance owns a host of other platforms, some of which, like I mentioned, Lemonade and CapCut, are very popular here, those apps would be reflected as well, would be affected in this action as well. And one of the things that TikTok argued in its complaint was that there's very little proof, like there's been very little scrutiny on these other platforms that are not TikTok, and therefore there's very little proof that those, that it would be okay to target those and to shut those down as well. And they've sort of described these other platforms that ByteDance owns that are popular with Americans as collateral damage in the bill that is aimed really primarily at TikTok. Another thing that TikTok has pointed out is that, shutting down TikTok, you'd be shutting down certainly the types of content that the U.S. government has said it's really concerned about: misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. But you'd also be removing a lot of a lot of content that's not problematic at all. So those could be anything from how to put on your makeup videos to book talk, which is all about what kinds of books you could read and book recommendations. And so the point that TikTok was really trying to make in the complaint was that, yes, shutting down the app in the U.S. government's perspective address some of these these concerns related to national security, but it could also shutter just more positive speech and other kinds of speech for the 170 million Americans who use the platform.
TikTok, in their suit, also pointed out what they believe is some hypocrisy. President Biden signed this bill into law that would either force the divestiture or ban TikTok in the United States. But he's running for re-election this year, and his campaign has a TikTok account. So what are they saying about this?
Well, I should tell you, Brittany, that as a reporter, that is one of the pieces of this that has me scratching my head the most. And I think that there's a lot of critics of the Biden administration and also creators, members of Congress, their staffers, who are also wondering, how could the president sign this law that would effectively ban the app in the United States as of next year if ByteDance doesn't agree to sell it? And shortly before doing that, he jumped on the app. His re-election campaign is now using it to reach prospective voters on the platform. And I think that and one argument that TikTok has made is that action alone really undermines national security concerns that the U.S. government has tried to make about the app, saying if the president and his campaign are, on this platform, how could there possibly be the national security concerns that for so long many have claimed exist with this platform? Another thing that they have argued undermines national security concerns with the app is the fact that several members of Congress who supported the law to ban, to effectively force the separation of TikTok and ByteDance, or else to ban TikTok, they too are using the platform to reach prospective voters and constituents. And so I think that it is worth watching that piece in particular, especially to see if there is pressure either on those members of Congress or on the Biden camp or both to get off the platform in order to help drive this across the finish line. And the last footnote that I'll add is that former President Donald Trump, who was the first one to threaten a ban of the app back in 2020, has done a complete about-face on his position around TikTok. He has come out in the last couple of months to say he didn't think it would be banned. He has sort of used that as he's used that sort of as a fighting point against President Biden, saying, look, that guy is banning this platform that you all love and violating your free speech, and I'm not. And now actually Trump is talking about getting back on the platform, and he's considering doing that in the coming months as he ramps up his re-election or his election campaign.
Saying that the app's a national security concern, calling for it to be banned or divested, ByteDance divesting from TikTok, and then being on the app definitely is a tough thing to square away here. But I also think an important thing to note is this bill that was signed into law is not a ban outright. It's forcing ByteDance to divest or then in a result of that, months later, TikTok would be banned in the United States. So what is TikTok in this lawsuit saying about the divestiture piece?
So one thing that I think is so interesting about TikTok's position on this exact point that you're asking about, like whether the two apps, or ByteDance and TikTok, can be separated, is that ByteDance or TikTok and ByteDance in this complaint, they basically make the case and finally admit to so many of the things that we have been reporting on about both companies for the last couple of years. So outwardly, over the last couple of years, TikTok and ByteDance have tried to project a real separation between the two companies, that they can operate separately, that they've got their own systems, that things have been walled off and cordoned off, and that for that reason, the purported national security concerns are really moot. What our reporting has repeatedly shown is just how entangled the two companies have been since day one. Employees who work at TikTok are always using ByteDance systems or ByteDance tools to do their work. So that's ByteDance's version of G Suite, for example. That's ByteDance's version of Salesforce. It's ByteDance's version of, Microsoft Office. And so we've really been able to show over the last couple of years in our reporting that these businesses are so heavily intertwined that it would not be really technically an easy thing to do to separate them. And in the complaint, the companies basically talk about how they're technically, they're logistically, because of personnel, that they're super intertwined. So I think that was a very interesting learning, and I think that the consensus is emerging, especially amongst experts who follow this closely, and also among employees or individuals who have worked with or worked at the company, that separating these two companies, unraveling them after they've been as intertwined with each other as they have been over the years, is really going to be difficult. And I think that the key piece of this is that the algorithm is sort of TikTok and ByteDance's secret sauce. It is this, really powerful, very meticulous, very valuable, but also extremely opaque algorithm. And basically, the Chinese government, TikTok said in its complaint, is not willing to allow the algorithm, which is basically its secret sauce. It's like the core of the entire business. The Chinese government will not allow that to be sold off, and that's a point that TikTok had made in the complaint. And I think that just goes to underscore both the reason why these two things cannot be separated in TikTok's view, but also I think it drives home the point, or some have said that it drives home the point, that the Chinese government is more attached to the business than both companies have really let on.
Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs is a Democrat from California, and she was against this bill. And she said this back in March when Congress was talking about it. Quote, "Not a single thing that we heard in today's classified briefing was unique to TikTok. It was things that happen on every single social media platform." Is TikTok using that argument in its suit as well?
Absolutely. That is a key point that TikTok and ByteDance are making in the complaint that they filed. They're saying, how could you be trying to deal with this platform in this way when there are American companies, and they specifically name-checked Google and Meta, which are the parent companies of two of TikTok's largest rivals in the United States, Instagram and YouTube. And they basically were saying they have the same data, they use the same data practices that we do. They have the same privacy concerns that we do. How are we the only ones being targeted? And of course, within that argument, there is not really an acknowledgement that those are American-owned companies, and that TikTok is a company that is owned by ByteDance, which is a China-based company, and it really doesn't take into account the fact that we are living in a much different climate here, where there is a clear separation between government and business, between church and state, if you will. And in China, there are rules that basically would allow the rules that would essentially allow the government to knock on the door of a business and say, this is the information that we want, you're going to have to give it to us. Because there's very little separation of church and state there, that is something that happens quite regularly there. And it's not viewed necessarily, in many cases, it's not really viewed as anything that unusual there, because it's just sort of the way that things operate. The laws are quite different. So yes, that is definitely a big, TikTok's big argument here is American companies are every bit as bad. They're not being targeted or regulated in the same way that we are. But I think that where that argument really falls flat is that there's little acknowledgement of the fact that they are owned actually by American companies.
I do want to read a quote that you pulled from TikTok from its lawsuit. In your reporting, TikTok claimed there are, quote, less restrictive and more narrowly tailored means to address the national security concerns. Can you talk about what they propose?
Absolutely. So there was actually negotiation that began with the Trump administration and then continued with the Biden administration with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., also known as CFIUS. And CFIUS is this interagency government body that basically reviews, mergers, acquisitions, and deals that could raise potential national security red flags. And so they were the ones that were negotiating beginning in 2019 under Trump and then continuing with Biden with TikTok to be able to reach some kind of a national security deal that would allay concerns around whether TikTok and ByteDance could access Americans' data and whether they could manipulate the content that people were seeing. And so the crux of the deal, as it was being worked out, was that TikTok was creating this under this big program called Project Texas, which was a $1.5 billion project that would essentially wall off American user data and have it basically overseen and monitored and audited by an American company that was Oracle. The goal was that TikTok was going to do all of these things that would eventually get CFIUS comfortable enough with making it okay for TikTok to continue operating here. Those negotiations began in 2019, and it appeared that they were actually trending in the right direction and close to nearing the finish line in 2022. But then, according to TikTok and their complaint, CFIUS sort of ghosted them. And so what TikTok's argument has been in the complaint has said if CFIUS had actually followed through with the negotiations that we were almost at the end of, that we were very close on, we could have solved this in a much different way, in an equally productive way that was actually less restrictive. And by the way, according to TikTok, the national security agreement that they were hashing out with CFIUS actually had a clause in it that would give the US government the ability to shut down TikTok if TikTok failed to comply with the terms of the contract. And so TikTok pointed to that and said, hey, that would have been a better way to go about this. And there, when you're considering these First Amendment cases, like these First Amendment arguments, the government really needs to take the least restrictive approach that can accomplish what they seek to accomplish. And TikTok's argument here was that there are, in fact, less restrictive ways to do this, one of them being the CFIUS agreement. But then the last thing I'll mention is that the other one could have been something like a national privacy law or some other kind of regulation that could have been passed by Congress that would have been sort of similar to digital regulations of tech platforms that have been passed in other countries like the UK, like in the EU.
Something that you mentioned at the top here was that we are in to watch a long legal fight between TikTok and the U.S. government. But as that develops, I hope you come back on and break it down for us. Alexandra Levine, thanks for your reporting.
Thank you so much for having me. Talk to you soon.